Thank you so much. Our last speaker is Kate Ryan, who's the Senior Program Coordinator of the National Women's Health Network and who spends her life working on policy issues.
With Diana. Hi. So I was also told I have 5 minutes, so I'm going to be really quick. So as Diana said, I do policy, and a lot of what that ends up looking like is advocacy with members of Congress, which, as you can imagine, is quite special these days. But what I'm going to talk a little bit about is that work, and in particular, work that I've done on the Hill that I have 2 hats on, my National Women's Health Network hat and my Q hat, and talk about sort of representing Q in these sort of legislative partnerships and kind of advocacy and support roles. Most of you, I'm sure, are familiar with clinicaltrials.gov. And I want to talk a little bit about that because while it is a great step in terms of this sort of open access and trying to really have more public transparency about the research that's being done, there are several exemptions and loopholes that really facilitate this problem of missing data and the misinformation that comes from that. And so there are 2 sort of big fundamental problems and a bunch of nitty-gritty ones that I will skip over, but feel free to ask questions. But the 2 biggest are registration exemptions and the reporting results exemptions. So in terms of the actual registration of clinical trials, the exemptions include early phase trials, they include feasibility trials, they include some trials conducted outside of the United States, which is massively increasing, so that's a huge problem, and a couple of others. They also have, the requirements for registration are significantly more broad than the results than reporting results. To the extent that, this is a slightly old number, but clinicaltrials.gov has more than 121,000 trials registered and only 4,700 approximately results published. So huge, huge difference. The reason for this is that the exemptions for the results reporting include that only data that is used in supporting applications to approve your drug or device at the FDA need to be reported. So this isn't, and now let me just say right now, let's be clear, no one's complying with that. So there are some people complying with that, but most companies don't. So obviously this means that we are missing, besides all the trials that don't need to be registered in support of those applications, what the real problem with this is that if a company is in the middle of testing an obesity drug and finds there's an increased risk of heart attack, and so they stop that and don't apply to the FDA, no one knows that. If another company a couple of years later decides to test the same compound, patients are exposed to that drug that is now known to be dangerous again, and no one ever knows. And that's, this is just the tip of the iceberg in terms of what we don't know about these drugs, because that doesn't get into some of the other things we talked about with only reporting the first 6 months of data. The other piece of this, of course, is that, thank you. So the other piece of this is that in supporting FDA applications, you don't need to, your marketing trials aren't submitted as part of your FDA application necessarily. Companies do 6, 10 trials while they're trying to get a drug approved, and the 3 best that they pick as part of their drug application are the only ones that ever need to be reported if they actually comply. So we're missing a lot. So I worked with Congressman Markey, now Senator, fantastic, Markey's office, to develop the TEST Act, which is the Trial and Experimental Studies Transparency Act. Many groups in the room, Q supported this letter. Diana and I are overlapping in Q and the Patient, Consumer, and Public Health Coalition. We also supported that piece of legislation, but what it does, if it passes, and it's been introduced both in the last Congress and this Congress, is to close some of these loopholes. So it would require that all biomedical trials that are conducted in humans have to be registered. So that will take care of our outside the U.S., our early trials, our feasibility trials. And it also requires that all results need to be registered. There are a couple of different timelines, whether or not that trial is used in support of an FDA application, or whether or not that trial is finished or stopped, or so it really gets rid of massively these loopholes. So the idea is to kind of move this forward, this doesn't take into account, this just closes loopholes. What this legislation doesn't really do is how to deal with the enforcement of registering and reporting these trials. It does require that NIH, which administers clinicaltrials.gov, report to Congress on, their company compliance. But we should also be clear, NIH also conducts trials, and they do not have a 100% record for registering and reporting their results either. So it's not that NIH is doing great and companies are doing badly. Pretty much they're all not doing so great. So ideally what we'd really like to see is some way to enforce this, which in the world of drugs and devices means financial penalties. So that's at the moment a hard sell. That's what we're pitching, but that's still a hard sell. And so if you have more questions, I will be happy to answer them or talk about it later. Because this is an ongoing effort. And now that Congressman Markey is in the Senate, hopefully Senator Markey, I don't know how one is the sponsor of a bill in both houses of Congress. We actually need to talk to the Office of the Parliamentarian about it. This is an ongoing question. But that is the goal, and hopefully we can expand clinicaltrials.gov in a way that it is actually useful. So thank you.